Here.
Colonel, Americans are being told three completely different stories at once. You have Pete Hegseth telling saying America won and Iran knows it lost. You have President Trump saying negotiations are ongoing, yet, up until yesterday, he was saying that he was going to bomb. And then he said, I pulled back because the Gulf countries asked me to. But anyway, I'm back at the negotiating table. And in his recent interview with 60 Minutes, you have Bibi insinuating that only he will decide when the war against Iran ends, openly demanding that uranium be physically removed from Iran, implying U.S. forces should do this. His words were, you go in and take it out. That's the best way. There's still work to be done. So, and now you have the Wall Street Journal saying Washington and Tehran are trapped in a dangerous middle ground that is neither peace nor full-scale war. Colonel, what are Americans and the whole world actually witnessing here? A real de-escalation or simply the pause before the next phase? It's driving everyone insane.
Well, I think Donald Trump has created a trap for himself, largely with his big mouth, because he's insisted that the Strait of Hormuz must open and the enriched uranium must be given up. And on both counts, the Iranians have consistently said, no, it's our sovereign right to do whatever we wish with the uranium that we have, and we're not giving up what we currently control, the Strait of Hormuz. So I think we're at an impasse of sorts. In other words, this is an immovable object right now. Nobody can move. Now, I do think that something you said is very important earlier, and that is what Bibi Netanyahu says. Because let's be frank, ultimately, he's in charge. We are fighting this war on the basis of Israeli demand. The Israelis demanded that we support them in this war. Donald Trump made promises to do so. He's very transactional. Lots of money was donated to his campaign by very wealthy billionaires who support Israel unconditionally. So he's honored his promise. I think at the moment, he's not waiting for anything else to arrive. The military is already deployed. They are positioned for attack. So I don't think that has anything to do with the delay. I think he's delaying in the hopes that he can find some way out of this that does not make him look foolish and stupid, to be blunt. For all the talk from Hegseth and others about how we've defeated the Iranian armed forces and so forth, it's all nonsense. I have to keep in mind that Iran's navy did not consist of a great fleet of ships to begin with. Iran is not a maritime power. Iran has managed to control the strait with a mix of robotic, small boats, undersea mines, and obviously the ability to strike anything that comes through it with its tactical ballistic missiles or unmanned systems. There is no navy per se as we understand it in the West. And frankly, Iran hasn't had much of an air force since the Shah left. So those things are just flat out erroneous, nonsensical, and irrelevant. The problem for Donald Trump is that we expended a lot of money, lots of missiles, lots of munitions, and we failed. We failed to make a serious dent in Iranian defenses. Now, in the meantime, the Iranians have replenished their stocks, resupplied. I think they're probably in better shape now than they were when the war began. I think the intelligence officers are effectively communicating that. It's very frustrating. And the other thing to keep in mind is the Iranians have learned from each and every incident that has occurred over the last many, many years and months. They know roughly where U.S. forces will attack from. They know what kinds of weapons and munitions the U.S. will employ. When you figured out your enemy, as well as the Iranians have figured out us, it's very disturbing if you want to launch new attacks. Now, he said most recently that the leaders of Saudi Arabia and the Emirates have asked him not to attack or to slow down or to pause. That may or may not be true. We know that the UAE, the crown prince there, which is very closely aligned with Israel, has urged him to destroy Iran. So I don't know how true that statement is. The Saudi crown prince, I'm sure, is very sensitive to this, as are the other Emirates, because frankly, if we go through another destructive round against Iran, Iran will retaliate very effectively against all the oil infrastructure, the desalination plants, and these governments could very well go out of existence. Now, in the Arab world, as you know, most of the elites in the Gulf are viewed as Epstein class members. They're not held in very high esteem. So these people could lose their positions in these places anyway. But at this point in time, I think the most we can say is that Donald Trump is trying to figure out what he should do. And I think ultimately he will decide to restart the war. I think that's where we're headed. But he's thrashing around. And, it's sort of like being in a fist fight with somebody, in the schoolyard when you're a kid. And when all else fails and nothing works, what do? You punch the other person in the face and hope for the best. I think that's where Donald Trump is. Well, I'll have to do what I did before. I'll do it better. And hopefully this will have the desired impact. I don't think it will, but I think that's where he's headed.
Colonel, I wanted to ask you on a personal level. With all your years in combat and all these years of strategic analysis, have you ever seen a conflict so flip-floppy, for lack of a better term on my part, being English isn't my primary language? Have you ever had to analyze and predict a conflict that just, especially when the commander-in-chief himself keeps shifting tone through speeches, interviews, social media posts almost by the day, on a personal level?
Well, the constant drumbeat of statements that make no sense is probably unprecedented. We haven't had as many statements in as short a period of time that were senseless as we have from Donald Trump. As I said before, he's been trapped in this position by his own big mouth. He never knows when to shut up, and he says far too much. However, strategically, this is typically American. I hate to be blunt about it, but if you go back to the Vietnam War, when our forces actually landed in Vietnam for the purpose of fighting, the forces that landed didn't know what they were supposed to do. They hadn't been given a clear mission. They didn't even have an objective to attack. In other words, there was no strategy. A strategic decision had been made to commit American military power to Vietnam to supposedly defeat communism. But none of the people going over there knew what that meant or how we were going to do it. And frankly, no one figured it out for the next 10 years. So we wasted billions of dollars and tens of thousands of lives, killed 2 million people in the process, and all for nothing. Now, one would have thought at that point it's over. We're not going to go through that again. But unfortunately, that's exactly what's been going when we went back into Iraq in 2003, when we went into Iran in 2001. There were no clear-cut, unambiguous goals. There was no coherent strategy. So when people said, well, you were going to occupy Iraq, why didn't you bring more troops? The answer was no. We never intended to occupy Iraq. That decision was made after we arrived in Iraq. Well, then you should have brought more troops. Well, there really weren't any more troops to bring. I mean, so this is not new. I could go all the way back to World War II when Eisenhower received this mission from Franklin Roosevelt. Your mission is to land on the European continent and destroy the German armed forces. And everybody said, oh, what a great order. Really? Where do you want to be when the war ends? Where do you plan to meet the Soviets? Are you going to meet the Soviets in Berlin, or are you going to meet them in Warsaw? How fast are you supposed to move? What's most important? Nobody did their homework. We sort of muddled through. And in each of these events, Americans have told the armed forces, well, just go and do it. Get in. I mean, one person, Paul Wolfowitz, in 2003 said it very well. He said, we don't want to fight with the generals. We just want to get the army into Iraq. Then the assumption was once the army was there, they would muddle through. So nothing has changed. Donald Trump says, I want regime change. That didn't work. Well, if regime change doesn't work, then and we haven't been able to encourage an internal rebellion, exploit all these millions of people that hate the government. Well, then I guess our mission is to destroy Iran. Iran, 93 million people, a nation the size of Western Europe, and you plan to destroy it. What's changed? Nothing. So what do you destroy first? How do you destroy it? How long will it last? How much money does this cost? How many lives do we lose? These are all the questions that should have been asked up front and never were, because we assume things. And the mother of all failures always consists of bad assumptions. And people assumed, oh, well, this will be like Iraq. Iraq's a nice, flat, open desert. There are only so many towns and cities. We can get in very easily without much interference. Most of these Arabs don't like Baghdad. They're not going to fight and die for it. I mean, all these kinds of things were assumed about Iran. Iran is not an Arab state. This is a sort of blatant ignorance and stupidity that characterizes thinking in Washington. And we are so big and so rich and so powerful that in most cases, we've been able to behave stupidly and get away with it. But this time, we have a different problem. The situation globally as a result of closing the Strait of Hormuz and destroying the Gulf and its infrastructure is profound. It is dangerous. The world is on a path to famine in many places. Our societies, our civilizations run on cheap energy. When energy is no longer cheap or isn't available, our societies, our civilizations stop. That's where we are now.
Colonel, this ties, your brilliant analysis right now ties in with what you recently wrote, that America hasn't truly won a major war since World War II, and that the absence of accountability inside the military establishment is one factor of that. And jumping from that to something that has to do, is connected, is you recently also wrote that American generals get a pass, win or lose, in war or peace, and that without real standards, that's why America keeps losing wars. You want that this revolving door between retired flag officers and defense contractors sits at the heart of America's broken military culture. It's something that is also witnessed strongly elsewhere in America, and with SEC officials leaving government for lucrative Fortune 500 jobs, or CDC and FDA officials later ending up in high-paying positions inside pharmaceutical companies. So when retired generals, defense contractors, and foreign influence networks and politicians beholden to the defense industry all sit inside the same ecosystem, Colonel, how can a system like that realistically ever reform itself?
It can't. And what you just described is what President Eisenhower warned the nation about before he left office. He gave a very famous speech and talked about the military-industrial complex. Originally, it was termed by Eisenhower the military-industrial congressional complex. But his aides told him, if you mention Congress, you'll just make more enemies. Let's drop Congress out. But he was right. All three are caught up in this. I think it's important to understand a few things about the United States. First of all, most people in the United States on any given day do not care what happens beyond their borders. That must be understood. If you go to Kansas City, Missouri, in the center of the country, if you go up to Washington State, to Seattle, or you go to, Portsmouth, New Hampshire, wherever you go in the country, very few people are aware of what's happening overseas. When you mention the word war, they think, oh, well, war is something that happens on someone else's soil. It doesn't happen here. So whatever happens over there really doesn't matter. When do Americans pay attention to what's happening overseas? They're paying attention when the economy fails, when it sputters, when it collapses. They pay attention when the financial system fails to work. They pay attention when they can't afford to buy food, when they can't afford to buy gasoline, when they can't afford to maintain a home and an automobile. That's when they pay attention. They pay attention when 2,000 or 3,000 Americans are killed. We slow rolled all of the casualties during World Wars I and II. People did not find out how many people had been killed in one day at Normandy. They didn't find out how many people were killed in one day in Okinawa until quite a while, long after these events had occurred. If you can prevent the American people from feeling pain, which is what Donald Trump and arguably all of his predecessors since Eisenhower have tried to do, if you can reduce that, Americans will let you do pretty much whatever you want. And when I say let you, I'm talking about people in Washington. Now, the other issue here, though, that nobody talks about publicly, or it's discussed but not very clearly, is the Jewish financial control of the United States. I mean, this is the elephant in the room. In the absence of that control, would we be at war with Iran? The answer is no, absolutely not. You see, that's very different from Vietnam. During Vietnam, people were told, well, communism must be stopped. If we don't stop communism, we'll end up fighting them here at home. It wasn't really the case, but that resonated. People understood communism represented a danger. In 1990 and 91, we went to Saudi Arabia. We brought in this tremendous force and we attacked into Iraq and Kuwait because the argument was we cannot allow Saddam Hussein to overrun the Arabian Peninsula. If he overruns it, he captures all the oil fields and the oil infrastructure, world stability, economic stability is at risk. People said, good, okay, we understand that. We didn't have very many casualties. People were happy. It ended. We went home. The problem that we've had with Iraq and Afghanistan is not so much the numbers of casualties because they're spread out over a long period of time and not very noticeable. We didn't lose 1,000 or 2,000 men in one day. But people finally said, wait a minute, when is this going to end? It's expensive. We don't see the point. So gradually we disengaged and got out. It was embarrassing, but nevertheless, we ended it and got out. This is very different now. This is a very different kind of situation. Everyone can see what's happening, but we still haven't lost very many people. And people have no feel for the amount of money that's being wasted. And they also don't understand that privately, President Trump in his conversations with President Xi of China or President Putin in Russia may have been very serious. In other words, we don't know what was discussed, but it's quite possible that both of those leaders warned Trump of dire consequences if he moves forward with this war. Now, what those consequences would be are not clear. But it's very obvious that neither Russia nor China will allow Iran to be destroyed. So if Iran looks like it might be destroyed or fall apart, we have to consider the very serious possibility of Russian and Chinese intervention to save it. Now, I'm sure all of those things are in the back of Donald Trump's mind, but he's a very emotional person. He believes that he's a winner and has never lost anything. He is a product of this man, Roy Cohn, very famous attorney that taught him, whatever you do, you attack. You never retreat. You never accept anything that anybody says. You deny anything that reflects unfavorably on you. And finally, whatever happens, you declare victory. That's why you hear lots of people saying, well, is there a way for Trump to declare victory and go home? The problem is there isn't, because he said, as we started with, no enriched uranium, can't control the Strait of Hormuz. Those are two things that the Iranians have said are not negotiable.
Yeah. Well, America is clear. It's trapped inside a permanent now war structure that it no longer knows how to disengage. And my question is, if it picks up again, the war, there are growing concerns that the first part? I mean, you had the June 25 part and you had this March 26 part that it has already consumed significant portions of U.S. missile stockpiles. So has the U.S. become overextended? And what does it mean if the conflict picks up again?
Well, we are overextended. We have too many commitments around the world that we cannot afford and cannot sustain. We have 250,000 troops spread all over the world on any given day. This is outrageous. It's unnecessary. It makes no sense in the current strategic environment. Again, most Americans aren't paying attention. But if you're one of the careerists in the Pentagon, if you're a general in the Army, an admiral in the Navy, a general in the Air Force, these commitments are very important because they help to justify your position. Remember that we're structured for global military hegemony. Now stop and think about that. The forces that we put into Europe should have been withdrawn in the 90s when the Soviet state collapsed and the Warsaw Pact was liquidated. But we didn't pull them out because we decided that the European states are effectively vassal states, dependent upon us. They have to do what we say, so we structure relations with them to benefit ourselves. The Europeans were complacent and lazy and decided it was easier and cheaper to let the United States determine their foreign and defense policy. Similar situation in the Gulf with the Emirates, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain. All of them fall into the same boat as the Europeans. And then when you go to Asia, we still have troops in Korea, troops in Japan, troops on various islands, troops operating periodically out of places like the Philippines and Thailand. We have troops in the Caribbean, poised to operate in Latin America. In other words, we are a global military hegemon. People don't want to give that up on the Hill because it involves great quantities of money, and the military doesn't want to give it up because they see a loss of prestige, structure, power, and money. Our military is at the senior level is not as professional, frankly, as what you see in Russia today. They have a very developed general staff system. They have liquidated, fired, removed all the senior officers who were corrupt or incompetent. We've never gone through anything like that because our generals, our admirals have all basked for 80 years in the afterglow of the Second World War. Americans see a general that wears 2 or 3 stars and says, oh, there's another George Patton. They see an admiral, oh, it's another Admiral Nimitz. No, these people are not the same. There's no connectivity whatsoever. That's beginning to be sensed, but people really don't understand how bad it is. So what you described from that article, the revolving door, they're not paying a lot of attention to it. And they don't bother to ask the question, how does someone show up to serve in Washington as a general officer? And he shows up a person of, let us say, modest means. In other words, not much money. And then he retires, and within a few years, he's a multimillionaire. Well, how does this happen? Well, you have to look at the various think tanks and industries and how he's placed in a position where he's rewarded for going along with all of the bad policies, the bad equipment plans and programs. In other words, good job, General. You killed Muslim Arabs for us. Good job, General. You killed Afghans. Good job, General. You're killing Muslim Iranians. Well done. And he's happy to take the money and run. He doesn't care. And there is this feeling, once again, that we are so big, we are so strong, we can't lose. Well, we're about to get an education. We have lost. We lost badly in Afghanistan and badly in Iraq because of our stupidity and ignorance. But it's not obvious to Americans. This time, a sudden withdrawal by President Trump and the armed forces from the region will demonstrate clearly, unambiguously, that we have suffered a strategic defeat. And for that reason, I don't think President Trump is ready to do that.
Yeah, neither is Bibi ready to accept him doing that.
For Israel, this is life and death. Israel is in very bad shape, as I'm sure you know. And sudden withdrawal from the region by us would probably spell the end of the Israeli state. Because right now it's very clear that given current circumstances, we will never go back into the Arabian Peninsula. Our bases are destroyed. Rebuilding them would cost us hundreds of billions of dollars. I don't think that's going to happen. So Israel is in its 11th hour. In other words, it's a few minutes before midnight and disaster. So from their standpoint, what has to happen? We have to succeed in destroying Iran. If we don't succeed in destroying Iran, Israel sees itself as probably finished in the region.
But after Iran, they've many times mentioned Turkey. It doesn't end for them with Iran. They have openly threatened Turkey through their former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett publicly and recently on repeated occasions, suggesting that Turkey is next, it's the final big war. And it all makes sense because, as we all know, after Iran, Turkey is viewed by them as their biggest final remaining impediment to them realizing the greater Israel vision. But with the US inside NATO, Colonel, and Article 5 still formally in place, Israel cannot realistically go to war with Turkey and go it alone. So what is your projection on this matter and on the future of NATO, which you have mentioned to me in an earlier interview that you consider NATO to be obsolete? But if NATO disbands, or if it doesn't disband, Colonel, if the US withdraws from NATO, which Trump has many times warned he will do, and much to Israel's liking, if that happens, then a war with Turkey is very likely between Israel and Turkey, because they want that war.
NATO is a zombie organization. It's essentially dead walking. NATO has died on the battlefields of Ukraine. They've poured money and equipment into it, technology. It hasn't worked. It hasn't performed. I predict that Ukraine will collapse this year, and this war will be brought to an end by the Russians. I think, in retrospect, the Russians will regret not having done that earlier, but I think this year they will do that. And that will be done militarily. And there is nothing anybody in Europe can do about it. Now, if you look particularly at the one state that matters most in Europe, which is Germany, the Germans are about to finally remove their chancellor. And the alternative for Germany, which is a nationalist organization that is opposed to the war in Ukraine, that government is going to come to power. That is going to be a game changer. But that new German government will take the position that NATO is also irrelevant and will leave it at some point in the near future. Our forces will be told to get out of Germany. We obviously are working overtime with the CIA and other front organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy and so forth to prevent that. But truthfully, that's where we're headed. So I wouldn't be too concerned about the NATO aspect of this whole thing. There'll be lots of talk, but not much action. The problem for the Israelis is that they have ignored the Turkish power capability, the potential, and they have focused very narrowly on Iran. When I was last there in 2020, I told a gathering of their senior military officers that, frankly, Iran should not be your focus, that there is a possibility, a potential to get along with Iran, to find an arrangement that suits both countries. And to understand that, you have to understand the difference between the Shiite Iranians, their relations with the West, and the Sunni Muslims and their relations with the West. Iran is not by nature an aggressive martial power. It just isn't. It's a civilizational state. It has its own history, and its size and its economic strength make it a great power by definition. But it's not bent on global conquest or regional conquest, and frankly hasn't been for 1,000 years. On the other hand, as we all know, Turkey is very different. And I tried to tell them that, I would be much more concerned about the Turks and their aspirations in the Middle East and Central Asia. But they haven't listened. And so I think they're going to awaken to the reality that they have not only Turkey to deal with on one flank, but also Egypt on the other. Because if you look at Egypt, the largest Arab country in the world, and probably the largest Sunni Muslim country in the Middle East, Egypt and Turkey have a certain commonality of interest, and it's called the elimination of Israel. You cannot call all of your neighbors subhuman and animals and then expect them to love you. And that is the view in Israel of Israel's neighbors. So the truth is, they had a chance to change course. They had a chance to make some sort of arrangements with Iran. They didn't do it. I mean, this is the sort of problem that nations have had in the past. You know, let me give you a quick example. Until World War I, the czars always knew that you had two big German powers. One was Germany, the other was Austria-Hungary. And they always knew that you could play one off against the other. And as long as they were separate, they didn't present a threat. Well, that mistaken policy by the Russians led to an alliance between Austria and Germany that obviously resulted in their destruction and defeat during World War I. So my point to the Israelis was, you've got to make friends with one or the other. You've got to get along with one or the other. If you don't, then you will be ground to bits between the two of them. And I think that's where Israel is headed right now. Now, finally, there's the United States. The United States is not interested in going to war with anybody. Now, that's not true for Washington, but it's true for the American people. And what you're seeing play out inside the United States right now is that Donald Trump's polling numbers are going through the cellar. His numbers right now are far worse than Richard Nixon's were in 1974 in the aftermath of the Watergate scandal. So if he goes forward and continues to attack Iran, he may not be president by the end of the year. Now, if he stops, if he admits we can't do this, this was a mistake, is it going to hurt him? Of course it will hurt him, but he's not going to be removed from office for it. Because the average American says, well, thank God he figured this out. Come home, fix the problems we have in the United States. They're more important than anything overseas.
Colonel, you're speaking of him as it makes everything you're saying it sounds logical and rational, but what was it? A few hours ago, he released a last-minute video urging Kentucky voters to back his preferred AIPAC-aligned candidate against Congressman Massey, even calling Massey the worst congressman in the history of the United States. So, what you say makes sense, and in a logical mindset. But I think Trump isn't on that wavelength.
No, you're right. You're correct. He has committed himself unconditionally to the Israel lobby and its Jewish financial power. That's where his loyalty lies. And this is what's going to get him into trouble. He has presided over an Israel first administration, not an America first administration. And that's why I think he's going to restart the war against Iran. And I think he's going to go down to defeat as a result. And you're right. This makes no sense. Absolutely none whatsoever. But again, he is a sort of a bundle of emotions. It's the best way I can put it. There is no rationality anymore. He is reacting on the basis of pure emotion and what he thinks is self-interest. He believes it's in his interest, no matter what it takes, to destroy Iran and serve the interests of his donors, the people that helped put him into the White House. And they are, for the most part, the forefront of the Israel lobby.
Yeah. And it's sad. It's sad, me as a foreigner, to see him make statements when he was asked to what extent are Americans' financial situations, motivating you to make a deal with Iran. He repeated, not the slightest bit. I don't think about Americans' financial situations. It shocked me. Imagine if I'm an American seeing my president making these statements, stating out clear where his true allegiance is and where his heart is. So, yeah. I want us to move to something else, though. Your comment, if you want to make a comment on that.
No, listen, I think you're absolutely right. And I'm disappointed because I thought he was a different person. He's behaved in ways that I did not anticipate. But I think there's a certain amount of unrealistic self-confidence born of ignorance and arrogance. You can't touch me. You can't stop me. So I can do whatever I like. I mean, that's his basic position. The other thing we shouldn't lose sight of is this. If you go back to his State of the Union speech back in, I guess, January or February, when he mentioned Iran and Israel and that he was going to make sure that Iran never had a nuclear weapon, everyone in the Congress gave him a standing ovation. Because ultimately, the same financial power that controls him controls the rest of the government. But at some point, it will become a matter of self-preservation and survival for people on the Hill to turn on Trump.
No.
That will come.
You mentioned earlier in our talk about the elephant in the room. I want to ask about another elephant in the room that's never been discussed on any not just mainstream media panel or also on podcasting panels, and is Israel already possesses nuclear weapons, operates outside the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, is not subjected to the same IAEA obligations imposed on others, and yet the U.S. and Israel are making this whole crisis about Iran's nuclear program, even though Trump mentioned back in June 2025 that they obliterated it. And now, less than a year later, we're once again being told that the war has been reinstated because of Iran possessing nuclear weapons. Why doesn't anyone discuss about Israel's possessions of nuclear weapons? We all know they possess them. There have been people that have come out and attested to that.
The number one reason is the Holocaust. Oh. The very state of Israel exists because of the Holocaust. Now, the Zionists were already trying to build a state before it became a recognized state by the United States and the United Nations. But it was not recognized as a modern nation state until after World War II, and that was largely a consequence of the Holocaust. So that's number one. Number two, eventually, both Eisenhower and JFK, President Kennedy, both of those presidents reined in Israel. In other words, they put up obstacles to the Israelis acquiring more territory. Eisenhower forced them to withdraw from the Sinai in 1956, along with the French and the British from the Suez. And then subsequently, President Kennedy refused to assist the Israelis with the development of a nuclear weapon. President Johnson changed all of that. Lyndon Johnson, who fought the Vietnam War, effectively let the Israelis do pretty much what they wanted. And they were successful in 1967. And everyone pointed to that victory in 1967 and said, see, this is a real country with real armed forces, and they are a useful ally to the United States. Well, we have no treaty of alliance with them, never have, but that was the argument. And I would say that since 1967, they have essentially been allowed to do pretty much whatever they want by the United States, and thanks to our influence also in the United Nations. And I don't see that that's going to change anytime soon. Now, it could change if President Trump goes back to bombing. Yes, then I think everything changes, because I think further destruction of Iran will ruin the Gulf. It'll make it 10 years before you see the Gulf recover to its former position in terms as a supplier of energy. And the consequences all over the world, in Europe, Northeast Asia, consequences for Japan, for Korea, for Southeast Asia, for the rest of the Middle East, all of those things will linger for a decade. We will suffer as a result of this. At home in the United States, I think it will result inevitably in regime change here.
The contrary to what they were expecting to happen in Iran, happened to them.
And Israel's position in the polling data, if you look at it right now, is unbelievably bad. We've gone from sort of 70 to 80% of Americans supporting Israel to something in the neighborhood of 20% or less. It's stunning.
But Colonel,
So again, if he goes back into this war, it will change.
Colonel, your thoughts on this nuclear double standard? Why isn't anyone calling out Israel for possessing nuclear weapons?
Because we have decided that the Jewish state, as a result of the Holocaust, deserves to have nuclear weapons to protect itself from all of its neighbors who hate it. That's the argument. Israel had a chance, a slim one, but it nevertheless had a chance to become what I would call a normal nation in the Middle East. It decided it did not want to be a normal nation in the Middle East. It wanted to be special. And it has advanced from being special to being a hegemon, because the United States Armed Forces are being employed to make Israel the dominant force in the Middle East. That's what we're doing. And it's not working.
I want to touch upon my fatherland, Lebanon. In South Lebanon, despite what's being called a ceasefire, villages are still being systematically leveled through controlled detonations and bulldozers, which are these are incentivized according to number of number of structures that they leveled. These actions, they are actually incentivized and monetized by the Israeli government. The Gazification of South Lebanon, we're seeing it, the footage coming out on X daily, much of it coming directly from Israeli accounts on X, as well as respected journalists like Steve Sweeney, who Tucker Carlson hosted, documenting the scale of village detonations, demolitions, drone strikes, daily phosphorus attacks, a banned weapon under international law. And then you have Israel's minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who celebrated the passage of the hanging law of the Palestinian prisoners. He's openly calling on Israelis to settle in Lebanon. Settler-linked groups tied to Uri Tzafon are advertising land in South Lebanon online for roughly $80,000. Now, residents are attempting to return to their villages within the Israel-occupied yellow zone, which extends 7 to 10 kilometers inside Lebanon. Any residents attempting to return are branded as terrorists, and they are taken out. 40 villages already inside Israel's declared yellow zone have been wiped out of the map, Colonel. They've been wiped out, completely leveled by the controlled detonations. And Israel issues daily evacuation orders now reaching as far as Tyre and Sidon, well outside their purported yellow zone. Now, according to Lebanon's Ministry of Public Health, since March 2 alone, roughly 2,600 Lebanese civilians have reportedly been killed, more than 7,900 wounded. This is over and above the 1,000 casualties already recorded during the November 24 ceasefire till March 226 resumption of the war, where Israel never even adhered to that ceasefire. They were daily doing operations with drones and phosphorus attacks. Over 110 paramedics killed since March 2nd, 90 ambulances destroyed, 18 hospitals bombed. This is just in Lebanon. More than 500 paramedics injured since March 2nd. So when you step back, Colonel, connect all these dots together, does Israel's operations in Lebanon look like the temporary security operation they claim it to be, or something much bigger underway, like them advancing their Greater Israel doctrine?
Israel is subjecting Lebanon to the treatment it has meted out to the people in Gaza. And there is a new term called Gazification. In other words, the ability to turn an area or a country neighboring Israel into an imitation of Gaza, effectively a desert that can then ultimately be reshaped as the Israelis decide. People in the United States do not understand this. They don't know anything about it. And a lot of that is a function of the mainstream media. And understanding the mainstream media means understanding who dominates and controls the mainstream media. The same financial power that is demanding war with Iran and demanding war with Russia in Ukraine. And that's the problem. And the average American has no understanding. If you sit them down and run them through pictures, photographs, film footage, and explanations of what's happening, they turn on the mainstream media, they don't see it. They don't hear it. I don't know how many times I've talked to people in my age group. I'm a so-called boomer. We refer to the people that were born after World War II as part of the baby boom. And when I talk to them, they say, well, Doug, I haven't heard that on mainstream media. And I say, well, it's time that you began listening to something other than mainstream media. Well, I'm not sure about that. And I don't think that's the president's fault. I said, well, the president isn't doing anything to stop it.
Exactly.
And then you have another attitude that is also manifest. Large numbers of people who, because of their, I would say, conditioning over the last 20, 25 years, dislike or feel nothing but contempt for Arabs. As far as they're concerned, oh, well, these are Arabs. We've dealt with them before. They're terrible. These kinds of things are very